Has everyone gotten one of the handouts? They're up here on the front table if you'd like to take one.
Anyone else take one? Raise your hand.
Okay, for those of you that were at town meeting, you will recognize this because it is virtually the same. The school board returned with essentially the same budget. We made a slight change to qualify to have an earlier meeting that's what statutorily allowed. And the statute dictates that if you make a change in your budget at all, you can do your budget every week if you'd like. You could have a meeting on it every week and present it every week and vote on it every week. Hopefully we don't have to do that. But the board felt that most of the problem was with the article itself, and hopefully the flyer that we sent out, everyone received that and understood it. Our budget is actually down a little over 6%, but if you read the article, it looks like our budget's up 14%. But again, as we explained at town meeting, that has to do with the way the number of pupils are calculated as equalized students. And for an explanation of that, I would ask Mr. Rucker to explain what the state did, and that bear in mind, while it looks like our student population went down because of that change in calculation, our student population has not changed. Again, it's just a change in how a figure was calculated. It was an arbitrary change, and it left a lot of towns with warnings that looked like they went up substantially in their budgets when they didn't. So if there's no objection, I'd like Frank to speak to the meeting. Mr. Ryder, is that all right?
Sure. This is not a standard town meeting, so anyone can speak and ask questions regardless of where they're from.
Oh, cool, okay. So, just be brief, this document here that's on the screen also is in the handout. It's the last page of the handout if you would prefer to look at the piece of paper. This document is developed by the Agency of Ed to help public understand tax implications and how a tax rate is developed in the school. The top section, Mike has already reviewed in that it is essentially the same spending amount, $4,079,000. That's what was warned in the published town report and then also in this handout. What was revised is the line 10, $395,000. So the board did revise the proposed budget from the point of view of it represents both a spending plan and a funding plan. So that change there, that 395, it was 385. So the board added $10,000 there, which reduced the tax liability slightly. And that brings us to the education spending here on the document on the screen here, the line 14. Getting to Mike's point about equalized students, this is where we take spending, it's called education spending per student, and we divide it by the equalized student figure. This is what Mike is referring to as being problematic from a public perception point of view. You see on line 15 the history. What this is 4 different years. The furthest column to the right is our proposed budget fiscal year 18. The one next to it is fiscal year 17, the year we're in. And you can see there's quite a change in the equalized student count. 239 going down to 219. Even though you may have heard Dana talk about enrollment being pretty stable in this building. Mike, as what he's explaining is there's a variety of laws that have affected the way in which the state calculates equalized students. 2 major changes were Act 166, which added a pre-K, universal pre-K to all Vermont public school districts. And essentially a whole nother grade was brought into the equalized student count, the pre-K. Act 46 also had a provision in it that removed what's called the hold harmless protection. And the hold harmless would be holding a tax rate harmless from a precipitous drop in enrollment. The threshold is 3.5%. If a town experienced a drop in enrollment more than 3.5% before Act 46, you would be limited to that effect. Act 46 said we're going to remove that protection and expand it to 10%. And in doing that, it also created downward pressure in fiscal year 18, the year that we're proposing. So fiscal year 17, I would say, again, we have no authority or responsibility for calculating equalized students. That's a mechanism that part of the funding law that the state does by reviewing income tax returns and student eligibility from around poverty statistics and assigning weights. It appears that they overweighted the statistic in fiscal year 17, which is the 239, and then as a result they underweighted the statistic in this year. If you take those two statistics, you see they come out at pretty close to the average of the prior years, which is more representative of what's really happening, somewhere around 220, 224. So as Mike has explained, this is out of our control, it's out of the school board's control. However, the calculation for what you see on a warning is based on 219 divided by the 3.6 million, which is equal to 16,786, and this is where you see on line 16 a 14% change. That is a required statistic to be published on the warning, even though when you go up to the top line 7 there, you see that the budget is proposed being down 6%, 6.3%. You see the prior year, $4,355,000. This budget is lower by $276,000. That's that's the number that the board manages and has the authority to control staffing and spending associated with the student population that we have.
Now, the significance of that 14%, if you look at the warning, for those of you that voted, you saw the warning, it leaves a definite impression that it's a 14% increase. The dilemma that the board has now is if we wanted to present that in a more positive fashion, one, it would be convince the state not to have that calculation, because then we'd see our per pupil costs have gone down, but that's not the reality. But to zero out that 14%, we'd have to cut $463,000 out of the elementary school budget. And that would be quite devastating. So the board is hoping that our budget does pass, because if it fails to pass and we do it again and it fails to pass, do it again, it fails to pass, at some point, I forget the date, Frank probably knows it better than I, we would have to borrow money, and we can only we'd have to reduce last year's spending by 19%. So we would have a 19% reduction in our budget. Any of those things would be devastating to the school. Of course, as I said, we're hoping that the budget does pass on Thursday. And if it doesn't, we'll be reconvening to try and figure out the implications of it not passing. I believe from discussions with Frank, it's $32,000, takes 1% off that 14. And you're a voter. I'm going to ask you, if you thought 14% was too high, at what point would you think it was reasonable? 10%? 8%, if you believe that was the increase, at what point, and that's one of the things the board has to think about is, at what point would the public think it's reasonable and then approve the budget? Because we still have, no matter what we do, no matter what we reduce, we have to present the budget in terms of per pupil cost. That we can't do. I checked last week with the Secretary of State's office, that's just how it is for now. So, Josh, what would you think would be a reasonable, if you thought that was our increase, what would you think would be a reasonable increase?
Well, I would hope I didn't think that, because I've paid good enough attention to understand that that number is not reality. So I don't really have a good answer for you in that
Okay.
respect.
So, I think you said that the actual budget by, with dividing it out by actual pupils is down 6%, thereabouts. Do you have the actual enrollment numbers versus the mythical
Yes,
enrollment numbers?
we have 160,
It's about 165 right now. Last year, we were at around 160. We have a sixth grade class of 22 students, and as of right now, we have 18 coming in kindergarten. Although you get hot off the presses numbers all the time, it's very hard to know exactly what that number is going to be.
So, but it'll be right around that 160 plus or minus a
Yeah.
few. And so that's been the number for 3 years, and the sort of fourth year back there was 2015. Was that also around 160?
For as long as this is my third year here, for as long as I've been here, it's been around that 160 number, between 158 and 167.
it's been stable for quite a bit of time. For those of you who've been in town long enough, when we added on to the school, we had anticipated having 300 students here when we added on. And then that declining enrollment throughout the state occurred, and occurred here in Vernon. We got down to 126 students at our lowest point. And now we're rebounding, and we stay stable, have slight upticks every year, and hopefully that'll continue. As I've said in other forums, people my age, Deb's age, when we put our house on, people even as young as Deb, when we're put our house on the market, we don't anticipate that someone's going to come in our age and buy our house. We anticipate it's going to be a young family, and I think that's what we're seeing happening now. The homes that are selling in town tend to be to people that are coming in and are bringing new children into town. So that, I think that's a plus for us. I see growth within the town. I think, like, the planning board is coming up with some great ideas for town, and I think we're going to be moving forward. So I think on the horizon it's good. Our problem right now is, how do we deal with this artificial number that we're saddled with? And we will try to work that through. But as long as we have to identify it, the board knew that we were going to have a hard time passing our budget. When we looked at the article, we went, wow, it looks like we're going up 14%. Vernon, I don't know if we've ever gone up 14% the whole time I've been on the board. And I've been on the board nearly 30 years. I don't think we've ever had an increase of probably more than, what, 6% on it at the most?
I was gonna say like 3 to 4%.
I think our biggest spike was when we did the addition.
Yeah.
And I think that was like a 6%. But customarily, when we have an increase, it's usually in the 2% range. We're not by far one of the higher spending schools. We're about mid-range statewide, and we're even in the WSSU, we're in kind of the middle of the pack. So I was really hoping to have a larger audience here to have a broader discussion of ideas from the public and how we can inform people as to what the reality of our budget is. Because I can envision on Thursday, people are going to go in and have that same perception. And then for us to start trying to reduce that 14% is going to be very damaging to the school. For folks that have been here a long time, you know that over the last several years, we've been slowly reducing our costs and our expenditures. So we're at a point now when we start reducing, it's going to be programs, and we're very concerned about that. So, anyone? Yes, thank you.
The town has a Facebook page, doesn't it?
I-
Does, the town has a Facebook page, does the school have a Facebook page?
Yes.
We do.
They should post on both pages what that information should be.
Good idea, Kelly. It's just so hard to explain.
We already have been on town's Facebook.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tim posts it right away, and Martin has been.
That was posted on the Facebook page.
Right.
I can get you a PDF of that
That would be
if
great.
you want to put it on that one.
Yeah.
I didn't see it.
We-
And we did the mailer last week to try and inform people that our population is stable and that our budget's down.
Martin, did you have something else you wanted, you were asking about the population, but I didn't know if that was in the context of a
No,
bigger
but I do have
question.
another question. So the decrease in the budget of 276,034, which is 6.34%. You know, I'm looking at the pluses and the minuses here, and it seems like pretty much that amount and more. And I asked this question at the previous meeting, but I still don't understand it, so I'm asking it again. You know, you have reductions in special ed of 80,000, 246,000, 26,000, which adds up to more than the 276 that the budget is down. So, you know, a few other things are up a little bit, but on the whole, the whole swing comes from whatever's going on with special ed, which seems to be zeroed out. Now, I know that special ed hasn't gone away, but it's moved out of this budget into somebody else's budget. Do I
Correct.
understand that right? And so, are we still paying for that in somebody else's budget?
Yes, what happened was, I think 2 years ago, there's a legislative requirement that special ed services be consolidated within supervisory unions. That consolidation reduces our costs because we're basically socialize the cost over a broader number of people. So that reduces that, it shifts to that total expense shifted to the WSCSU, but we still have services, and those are billed back to us, the services that we actually utilize. So a simple way would be, rather than having to have a staff person here at all times, we share staff people with other schools. That would be one of the dynamics of doing that.
But we still pay.
Okay, but we still pay
We
out
still
of
pay.
this budget somewhere? Or
Yes.
So where would that cost have gone from?
That would go to the assessment from WSCSU.
So page 4, if you look at page 4, I read these changes. The bottom. Page 4, the bottom, you see in the bold, special education, series of numbers, but in fiscal year 18, 370,000. That's still procuring services for special education.
So this 370, where is that on the first page?
On the first page, it's part of special education. See 370 right here.
I got you, but that's reduced from the previous year.
So the other significant change in the legislation that Mike just referred to is the way in which the revenues are passed through. So when you go up to the top of the document, that on the first page, that's the special education is in, you see that it has a special education block grant, intensive
revenue, yeah.
aid, yeah. You may have noticed that those revenues are also zeroed out. So the thing that explains most of the change is the revenue has now been directed to the SU as well. The SU credits that revenue against the expense to run the program. and sends out a bill to Vernon at a net cost. So if you look at an apples to apples comparison, special education is actually up a little bit, not much. It's pretty level funded. Another way to say it is if you took fiscal year 17 revenues of special ed, you see that 246,000 in intensive, 80,000 in the block, 26,000 in essential. So that's over 300,000, right? Well over 300,000. Well, that 300,000 has been applied against, coming back down here where you saw the 370, it's been applied against the 668 the prior year. And that's how you get substantially lower number in the new year. All the services are still being provided, as Michael said, the shared service model is more effective in terms of cost effect. But the end result is still programs are going to students as they have in the past.
Yeah, but, so the $297,000 reduction in special ed expenses to this district, right? It's being carried somewhere.
It's being carried at the supervisory union, and that 370 goes to the supervisory union.
Right, so does that mean, and how does the supervisory union get paid for that?
They're gonna get the 370 from Vernon,
Yeah.
and then they're gonna get what was about 350,000 that used to go to the Vernon is gonna be coming to the
So instead
supervisor.
of coming to Vernon, flowing through to them,
Yeah,
it goes direct?
it's been netted, yes. Mhm.
Okay.
That's it.
Josh, you had a question?
You know, I'm kind of piggyback up on what Martin said is, from the looks of it, that's the majority of that cut that was made. And in fact, it's not really a cut, it's a movement of money from the school to the supervisory union, where we just share the expense versus paying it from the school. So there was no actual cut to the budget itself, it was a movement.
Well,
It-
the bottom
in
line
essence.
was reduced by 6.4%. So there is a budgetary reduction.
But it was still, the town of Vernon still pays for it through the WSESU fee. It's just a lesser amount because it's spread over more.
Well, we pay for a significant portion of it with our state aid money
Yeah.
for special ed. So rather than it coming here, it goes to WSSU. So that's how our budget goes down, because that's what's paying for that.
But it also reduces revenue to the school at the same time, kind of balancing that.
So, Josh, another way to get at your question is, if you remove the effect of special ed, that reduction, as Martin has pointed out, then you can see that, you know, to take away, the whole budget's down 276 and special ed's 297. The effect of the regular ed is, it is about a $60,000 increase, which is a 1.6% change. And when you look at your handout, that 60,000 is almost entirely explained by one line item on page 2. The elementary school tuition, 45,000. You see, as you scan down the page, 000, and then there's a $45,000 increase in this proposed budget. You know, so I mentioned the total regular ed budget's up 60,000. Well, 45,000 is this line item, and this line item is associated with what Vernon has done over the years, which is you know, assessing student need and then finding the best solution for that student or students.
Any other questions or comments from anybody?
I have a question. I'm sorry, I'm a new resident, and I'm just trying to understand the budget information. The 14% seems a bit scary to me, and that's why I came this evening. And I understand now from your explanation about the 14%, I just wasn't aware of that. You know, it's interesting, I have, you know, lived as many years of my life as I have and just didn't have any idea about the 14% where it came from. So can you just, that's a state thing?
Yes. The 14%, there's a calculation for equalized pupils. And the state changed one of the factors in that calculation, and it made our student population look like it went down by about 20 students when in actuality it had not. And then when you divide the number of students by the amount spent, it looks like a larger amount or a larger percentage spent. Frank, do you know if they had not changed our calculation, what our percentage would have been for per pupil cost? It would have been down a little bit, right?
Yeah, you know, because we don't have the basis of how they assign weights, we can't really pull it apart other than to do what we're doing this evening, which is to say we know how many kids are really in the building, and we know that the effects of adding pre-K have had an impact, but because, unlike where we sit down and build our budget and we can add things up and subtract things, we really have no basis of looking into how they created those numbers.
So you're likely to keep having this problem if the equalized students starts to look more like actual students.
Well, the issue
They
is
bring it down towards the 160.
the issue is the integration of new legislation. But your question points to if we talked about 165 here, and how come this number is 220? And the majority of explaining that difference is that there are another 42 students in this budget on page 5, I think, that are part of that 220, and those students are your secondary students at Pioneer or Northfield Mount Herman or wherever they may go. It's page 4. It's the $700,000 budget there, you see, like from 700 to 760. So that represents, from a student census point of view, another 42. So 165 plus that 40 is, 207. And then you might say, well, how do they get to 220? Generally, the balance of that is going to be pre-K. That's the new group that got counted. There are 30 pre-K students, but they add only about a half a student per pre-K because they're not here all day. So half of 30 is about 15. That's how we get in the ballpark. You go from 207 plus 15, so 222, we're kind of in the ballpark. But then to say, okay, how did they assign a weight for poverty, a weight for English language learner, a weight for secondary, those are the things that we can't account for. But that's how we get somewhat close to 200.
All right, well, that's interesting though. So when you talk about 160, 165, this budget really does cover the 207 plus the pre-K.
It does.
And so how is that, so you should really talk about those numbers. How is that varied over these 4 years?
The pre-K is totally new.
Yeah.
It's a law that came in that did substantially increase the statistics we saw from 224 to 240. So that's probably the only segment that's been quite variable. Otherwise, enrollment here has been between 160 and 170 for quite some time. And actually the enrollment on the tuition, the reason why the 700,000 is down is you can see the actual 678. The actual, meaning the year ended June of 2016, we actually spent 678,000. Enrollment in the secondary has declined, and so has spending.
Right, and that's one of those variable items. Some years we have more students go to other high schools, and in some years we don't. On average, it's about 80% of the students from here, from our elementary school, go to Brattleboro. So over the years, it's kind of fluctuated. I think at one time, there was probably 25% of our students went somewhere else. Back 25 years, probably 10% of our students went somewhere else. So that is a variable. As long as parents maintain the option to send their students other places, you'll see that. That, again, is another piece of legislation that occurred when the legislature, we used to pay for all the students directly through our budget at the high school. And then legislation changed that, so the high school actually, we no longer pay for high school students directly through our budget. It's an assessment that comes from the high school to here, to the townspeople here. So that was a change, and that's why we have this secondary, is that piece. Anyone that doesn't go to BUHS, we pay through our budget. But either way, the residents of the town of Vernon pay for our high school students regardless of where they go.
Anybody, anything, Josh?
Now, I know that there's a cap on pure pupil spending, I'm not gonna be able to say that right, before we get penalized. How close are we to that cap? I think we're hundreds of dollars away, but
We are,
We're well under that. Dana has the number right there, you see the 16,786, that line 16. And then the line right below it, 17,386 is the penalty. So we are significantly below that. We want to try to quantify that. All we do there is we take the difference and you multiply it times 219 kids, and that's the dollar amount. So I can do that for you. 17,386 minus 16,786 is $600. So that times 220 is the amount that we are under the threshold in our budget, 132,000. Another way to say it is if the board added 132,000 to this budget, their cost per student would be 17,386, and you'd be right at the threshold.
and for boards in general, that's kind of a goal, is not to get to the threshold.
Sure.
It's very, very punitive if you go over the threshold. And some discussions in Montpelier, it'll be more punitive than further out in time. But there are a significant number of schools in the state that are well over. For whatever.
$132,000 isn't very much when you're talking about almost $4 million, so we're not that far away in all reality.
No, and the scary part of that is something that Dana spoke about earlier, that $45,000. When we have out-of-district placements, all you need is 3 or 4 students, and we would go over the cap.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it's not of great comfort, but we certainly are not alone in the state. That's why there's been lots of clamoring for changing the way we finance education.
Anything else from anybody?
Well, hopefully, if you support our budget, you'll try to explain this to people. I mean, it's extraordinarily difficult. For us, we've been doing it for most of us a number of years now. It's not getting any easier. As Frank says, the state will always come up with something that you don't know where it came from, but here's the factor you have to deal with. The one thing I must say is we are very fortunate. Many supervisory unions and school districts do not have a finance officer that understands this stuff all that well. At least we are very fortunate that Frank really, he gets it, he knows it well, and thus far has given us pretty good guidance on what we should do. So I would like to thank Frank for his expertise, and we're happy that he's here. Because I know there's some districts that they're clueless. They don't know how to deal with this at all.
So please vote for our budget.
Yes, thank you.
You can vote absentee tomorrow and Wednesday, polling hours 7 until 7 at Town Hall. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim.